everyone, welcome back to your YouTube channel, The Ultimate Audiobook. Social hierarchies. Let us stand back from the details now and try and get a sense of the social structures of the empire. Tacitus described the leading social groups of the early empire as follows. Senators, leading members of the equestrian class, the respectable section of the people, those attached to the great houses, the unkempt lower class, plebis sordida, who, he tells us, were addicted to the circus and theatrical displays, and finally the slaves. In the early 3rd century, when the Senate numbered roughly 1,000, approximately half of all senators still came from Italian families. By the late empire, which starts with the reign of Constantine, first, in the early part of the 4th century. The first two groups mentioned by Tacitus, the senators and the equites, had merged into a unified and expanded aristocracy, and at least half of all families were of African or Eastern origin. This late Roman aristocracy was enormously wealthy, but in many ways less powerful than the purely military elites, who came almost entirely from non-aristocratic backgrounds. The middle class now consisted of the considerable mass of persons connected with imperial service in the bureaucracy, an army, but also the more prosperous merchants and farmers, of whom there were many in the eastern provinces. Tacitus described this respectable middle class as clients of the great senatorial houses. Now it was chiefly government service and dependence on the state that sustained many of these families. Below them were the vast mass of the lower classes, known collectively as humiliates. They comprised a rural labor force, of which many were permanently employed on the large estates, workers in industrial and mining establishments, migrant workers who supplied much of the labor for the grain and olive harvests and for the building industry, self-employed artisans who, it was said, were better fed than wage laborers, a large mass of casual laborers, especially in the big cities, and of course, the many thousands of slaves that were still found all over the Western Empire in particular. The equites, knights or horsemen, were traditionally the second most powerful and wealthy group. Originally, they were families whose property qualified them to serve in the cavalry, hence the name. Like senators, most knights were landowners, but unlike senators, many of them were shipowners, traders, and bankers, that is, involved in business activities. One writer of the early 5th century, the historian Olympiodorus, who was also an ambassador, tells us that the aristocracy, based in the city of Rome, drew annual incomes of up to 4,000 ephs of gold from their estates, not counting the produce they consumed directly. The monetary system of the late empire broke with the silver-based currencies of the first 3 centuries, because the Spanish silver mines were exhausted and government ran out of sufficient stocks of the metal to support a stable coinage in silver. Constantine founded the new monetary system on gold, and there were vast amounts of this in circulation throughout late antiquity. Incomes of the Roman aristocracy, early 5th century. Each of the great houses of Rome contained within itself everything which a medium-sized city could hold: a hippodrome, fora, temples, fountains, and different kinds of baths. Many of the Roman households received an income of 4,000 pounds of gold per year from their properties, not including grain, wine, and other produce, which, if sold, would have amounted to 1/3 of the income in gold. The income of the households at Rome of the second class was 1,000 of 1,500 pounds of gold. The late Roman bureaucracy, both the higher and middle echelons, was a comparatively affluent group because it drew the bulk of its salary in gold and invested much of this in buying up assets like land. There was, of course, also a great deal of corruption, especially in the judicial system and in the administration of military supplies. The extortion of the higher bureaucracy and the greed of the provincial governors were proverbial. But government intervened repeatedly to curb these forms of corruption. We only know about them in the first place because of the laws that tried to put an end to them, and because historians and other members of the intelligentsia denounced such practices. This element of criticism is a remarkable feature of the classical world. The Roman state was an authoritarian regime. In other words, dissent was rarely tolerated, and government usually responded to protest with violence, especially in the cities of the East, where people were often fearless in making fun of emperors. Yet a strong tradition of Roman law had emerged by the 4th century, and this acted as a brake on even the most fearsome emperors. Emperors were not free to do whatever they liked, and the law was actively used to protect civil rights. That is why in the later 4th century it was possible for powerful bishops like Ambrose to confront equally powerful emperors when they were excessively harsh or repressive in their handling of the civilian population. Late Antiquity. We shall conclude this chapter by looking at the cultural transformation of the Roman world in its final centuries. Late Antiquity is a term now used to describe the final fascinating period in the evolution and breakup of the Roman Empire and refers broadly to the 4th to 7th centuries. The 4th century itself was one of considerable ferment, both cultural and economic. At the cultural level, the period saw momentous developments in religious life, with the Emperor Constantine deciding to make Christianity the official religion, and with the rise of Islam in the 7th century. But there were equally important changes in the structure of the state that began with the Emperor Diocletian, 284 to 305. And it may be best to start with these. Overexpansion had led Diocletian to cut back by abandoning territories with little strategic or economic value. Diocletian also fortified the frontiers, reorganized provincial boundaries, and separated civilian from military functions, granting greater autonomy to the military commanders, who now became a more powerful group. Constantine consolidated some of the changes and added others of his own. His chief innovations were in the monetary sphere, where he introduced a new denomination, the solitus, a coin of 4.5 grams of pure gold that would in fact outlast the Roman Empire itself. Solidi were minted on a very large scale, and their circulation ran into millions. The other area of innovation was the creation of a second capital at Constantinople, at the site of modern Istanbul in Turkey, and previously called Byzantium, surrounded on 3 sides by the sea. As the new capital required a new senate, the 4th century was a period of rapid expansion of the governing classes. Monetary stability and an expanding population stimulated economic growth, and the archaeological record shows considerable investment in rural establishments including industrial installations like oil presses and glass factories, in newer technologies such as screw presses and multiple water mills, and in a revival of the long distance trade with the East. All of this carried over into strong urban prosperity that was marked by new forms of architecture and an exaggerated sense of luxury. The ruling elites were wealthier and more powerful than ever before. In Egypt, hundreds of papyri survive from these later centuries, and they show us a relatively affluent society where money was in extensive use and rural estates generated vast incomes in gold. For example, Egypt contributed taxes of over 2.5 million solidi a year, roughly 35,000 eps of gold, in the reign of Justinian in the 6th century. Indeed, large parts of the Near Eastern countryside were more developed and densely settled in the 5th and 6th centuries than they would be even in the 20th century. This is the social background against which we should set the cultural developments of this period. The traditional religious culture of the classical world, both Greek and Roman, had been polytheist. That is, it involved a multiplicity of cults that included both Roman and Italian gods like Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, and Mars, as well as numerous Greek and Eastern deities worshipped in thousands of temples, shrines, and sanctuaries throughout the empire. Polytheists had no common name or label to describe themselves. Two other great religious traditions in the empire was Judaism. But Judaism was not a monolith either, and there was a great deal of diversity within the Jewish communities of late antiquity. Thus, the Christianization of the empire in the 4th and 5th centuries was a gradual and complex process. Polytheism did not disappear overnight, especially in the western provinces, where the Christian bishops waged a running battle against beliefs and practices they condemned more than the Christian laity did. The boundaries between religious communities were much more fluid in the 4th century than they would become thanks to the repeated efforts of religious leaders, the powerful bishops who now led the church to rein in their followers and enforce a more rigid set of beliefs and practices. The general prosperity was especially marked in the East, where population was still expanding till the 6th century, despite the impact of the plague which affected the Mediterranean in the 540s. In the West, by contrast, the empire fragmented politically as Germanic groups from the north, Goths, Vandals, Lombards, etc., took over all the major provinces and established kingdoms that are best described as post-Roman. The most important of these were that of the Visigoths in Spain, destroyed by the Arabs between 711 and 720, that of the Franks in Gaul, and that of the Lombards in Italy, 568 to 774. These kingdoms foreshadowed the beginnings of a different kind of world that is usually called medieval. In the East, where the empire remained united, the reign of Justinian is the high water mark of prosperity and imperial ambition. Justinian recaptured Africa from the Vandals in 533, but his recovery of Italy from the Ostrogoths left that country devastated and paved the way for the Lombard invasion. By the early 7th century, the war between Rome and Iran had flared up again, and the Sasanians, who had ruled Iran since the 3rd century, launched a wholesale invasion of all the major eastern provinces, including Egypt. When Byzantium, as the Roman Empire was now increasingly known, recovered these provinces in the 620s, it was just a few years away, literally, from the final major blow which came, this time from the southeast. The expansion of Islam from its beginnings in Arabia has been called the greatest political revolution ever to occur in the history of the ancient world. By 642, barely 10 years after the Prophet Muhammad's death, large parts of both the Eastern Roman and Sasanian empires had fallen to the Arabs in a series of stunning confrontations. However, we should bear in mind that those conquests, which eventually, a century later, extended as far afield as Spain, Sindh, and Central Asia, began in fact with the subjection of the Arab tribes by the emerging Islamic State, first within Arabia and then in the Syrian desert and on the fringes of Iraq. As we will see in Theme 4, the unification of the Arabian Peninsula and its numerous tribes was a key factor behind the territorial expansion of Islam. Rulers and events 27 BCE to 14 CE. Augustus, first Roman Emperor, 14 to 37 Tiberius, 98 to 117 Trajan, 117 to 38 Hadrian, 193 to 211 Septimus Severus, 241 to 72 reign of Shapur I in Iran, 253 to 68 Gallienus, 284 to 305 the Tetrarchy, Diocletian main ruler, 312 to 37 Constantine, 309 to 79 reign of Shapur II in Iran, 408 to 50 Theodosius II, compiler of the famous Theodosian Code, 490 to 518 Anastasius, 527 to 65 Justinian, 531 to 79 reign of Khusro I in Iran, 610 to 41 Heraclius. Events 27 BC, Principate founded by Octavian now calls himself Augustus. C 24 to 79, life of the elder Pliny, dies in the volcanic eruption of Vesuvius, which also buries the Roman town of Pompeii. 66 to 70, the Great Jewish Revolt and capture of Jerusalem by Roman forces. C 115, greatest extent of the Roman Empire following Trajan's conquest in the east. 212, all free inhabitants of the empire transformed into Roman citizens. 224, new dynasty founded in Iran called Sasanians after ancestor Sasan. 250s, Persians invade Roman territories west of the Euphrates. 258, Cyprian, bishop of Carthage, executed. 260s, Gallienus reorganizes the army. 273, caravan city of Palmyra destroyed by Romans. 297, Diocletian reorganizes empire into 100 provinces. C. 310, Constantine issues a new gold coinage, the solidus. 312, Constantine converts to Christianity. 324, Constantine, now sole ruler of empire, founds city of Constantinople. 354 to 430, life of Augustine, bishop of Hippo. 378, Goths inflict crushing defeat on Roman armies at Adrianople. 391, destruction of the Serapeum, temple of Serapis at Alexandria. 410, sack of Rome by the Visigoths. 428, Vandals capture Africa. 434 to 53, empire of Attila, the Hun. The 493 Ostrogoths established kingdom in Italy. 533 to 50 recovery of Africa and Italy by Justinian. 541 to 70 outbreaks of bubonic plague. 568 Lombards invade Italy. c. 570 birth of Muhammad. 614 to 19 Persian ruler Khusro II invades and occupies eastern Roman territories. 622 Muhammad and companions leave Mecca for Medina. 633 to 42 first and crucial phase of the Arab conquest. Muslim armies take Syria, Palestine, Egypt, Iraq, and parts of Iran. 661 to 750 Umayyad dynasty in Syria. 698 Arabs capture Carthage. 711 Arab invasion of Spain. Exercises. Answer in brief. First, if you had lived in the Roman Empire, where would you rather have lived? In the towns or in the countryside? Explain why. Second, compile a list of some of the towns, cities, rivers, seas, and provinces mentioned in this chapter, and then try and find them on the maps. Can you say something about any three of the items in the list you have compiled? Imagine that you are a Roman housewife preparing a shopping list for household requirements. What would be on the list? Why do you think the Roman government stopped coining in silver? And which metal did it begin to use for the production of coinage? Answer in a short essay. Suppose the Emperor Trajan had actually managed to conquer India and the Romans had held onto the country for several centuries. In what ways do you think India might be different today? 6. Go through the chapter carefully and pick out some basic features of Roman society and economy which you think make it look quite modern. We have completed theme 3rd. If you like the audiobook, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Ultimate Audiobook. Thank you and bye bye everyone.